You could have heard this episode 48 hours early on our Patreon, patreon.com/indieheadspodcast. By joining us for as low as $1 a month, you'll receive episodes early and gain access to our Discord server. All of our upcoming episodes will be up on our Patreon 48 hours before it hits our public podcast feeds. But if you're hearing this via our Patreon feed, we thank you so much for your support. We especially want to thank our Real Ones patrons, including Becca NTN, Georgia Mikowski, Alex Grichmanoff, Baby Buko, Josiah Duncan, Jenna LaFleur, Grant McSpooky, Old Man Withers, Jackson Chris, Alex, Matt Kapczynski, Mark Berry, Aaron Hillsamer, Darian Fisher, Gay Horse 420, Cal 50, Mommy I Just Went Boom Boom, Chris Wade, Jacqueline Kataga, Alec Felder, Eraserhead Baby, Selectric, Rob Marino, Dylan, Waffle113, Noah Kurtz, Tony DeSerafino, Maze Farms, and Derek Pemberton. To become a real one, consider supporting us with a $5 a month donation for receive bonus episodes every month and get a shout out at the top of the pod. Anyways though, enjoy the episode. And hello, everybody, and welcome back to a special edition of the Indieheads podcast. I'm your host, Matty. I'm Irvian Prince on Twitter. Folks, it's time. It is the most important year in the list of the year. It is the Indieheads podcast album of the year list, our top 10 albums of the year. Most likely when this podcast comes out, I think, or at least either between this or the second part of this episode, we should have our top 25 albums up on our Substack, softsounds.substack.com. But we're going to go really in depth on our top 10 albums of the year. And of course, joining me, I'm saying this before I get like beat up, like the pod trans. They've cornered me in an alley. They're getting ready to beat the shit out of me. They have crowbars.
The songs to trans your gender.
Violent takeover. This is a peaceful transfer of
slow
power.
and gradually with a lot of force swimming.
Exactly. You introduce one trans woman to the podcast, and slowly she co-opts multiple others, and then all of a sudden it just becomes a hive mind that takes over everything. We weren't joking when we said at the end of the songs to trans your gender 2 episode that this is just the takeover beginning, because it is the takeover beginning.
Yeah, that was very deliberate foreshadowing on our part. And if the full list is out by the time you're hearing this, you understand why all 4 of us are on this episode.
This was not like a coordinated coup. This is just we are the 4 people who happen to like the albums that have glommed to the top this year, partly because we have our own voting coalition, but also just because a lot of the records that we happen to like this year took on with other people in the chat, just enough so that we could get our agenda really through. But our agenda is widespread. We've got some good picks this year. I'm really, really, really happy with our list for reasons that will become abundantly obvious very soon. But
yeah, I just really want to state for the record, like, here's the thing with the Indieheads podcast, the album of the year list, and me, it's almost always been separated. Like, I've always never been with the general podcast zeitgeist, generally speaking. There's stuff I usually like in the top 10, but like there's always stuff. It's rarely, if ever, going to match my own top 10. I may be the host of this podcast, but am I the tastemaker of the Indieheads podcast? Oh, fuck it, absolutely not. Jesus Christ. Otherwise, we would have had Madlow Album of the Year last year, and I would have been very happy with that. But yes, so I'm just speaking now because listeners, if you love my voice, you're not going to hear it a whole lot on this episode.
You'll butt in for something in part 2. There's a little more for you to contribute to, I think, in that section. Section 1 is my time to shine, as they say, but we will get to all of that.
Look, more and more people are saying it's Jackie time.
Everything's coming up, Jackie. I maybe don't have the novel coronavirus. We're not 100% sure on that, but we're figuring it out, and we've got fun albums to talk about. So everything's coming up, Jackie.
Yeah, so let's just get into it. So we're
right away.
Yeah.
Already a passion project of mine was maybe from the moment I heard this album, I was like, can we get this on the list this year? Like we have our big plan that will pay off in episode 2, which I think is probably obvious to anyone who follows me or like follows one of the other pod trans women on the internet. But this is like can we really like this was me pushing my luck essentially.
Yeah, we were all like just kind of like,
hey, our plan is working. Can we like grab something else from our bank heist on the way out? And we absolutely did, because we managed to get Fire Tools' Eternal Home sneaking right in at the 10 spot. This is we're gonna talk about albums later today that are like Unhinged, Feral, etc. Like a lot. This album is the most a lot of anything I've heard this year. This album is fucking insane in the best possible way. If you're not at all familiar with Fire Tools is the musical project of Angel Markloyd, I believe is her last name.
Yep.
She's from Chicago. I thought this was a band when I first discovered them, but of course this is just one trans woman in a basement, which is what all of the best bands are. Yeah, this is a project that trying to give it a genre identifier feels fucking silly. Because you have to
Can I
use
just read the track titles off so people can get an idea of what we're going for here?
Just start reading some track titles.
Okay, so umbilical cord blood, yearning equals alchemical fire, window to window to window to window, thick flowy glowy sparkly stingy pain.mpeg. Outside there's a little emoticon in the middle, bears, world of objects minus fluids, and of course window to window to window to window to window.
Yes, there's one extra window, very important.
And that's side A out of D.
Yes, this is a 4-disc record, which is something that I am like ideologically opposed to at this point. I've been yelling all year about how albums are too long, and there's so much about this record that could and should like feel exhausting or feel like someone just throwing shit at the wall. And the reason why I wanted so badly for this to be on the list is I think it is a genuine achievement the way that this album, I went through all 25 tracks, almost an hour and a half of music, and I was never bored once. Let me tell you, there was never one part of that hour and a half where I was like, it could be doing more. It's always doing so much all of the time. And then second of all, it also like was just genuinely so fun. Like I didn't feel like I was like forcing myself to sit through this like this experiment that was like pushing the boundaries. I was just I was cackling like a witch. I was having a great time. I was like, I can't believe she's done this. And there are just so many moments on this record that I think some people are going to miss out on because of how intimidating this project is, that are, I think, really accessible and interesting. And of course, she saves all of the most accessible stuff for like disc 3 on the album because of course, like you have to get through stuff like the second track, which is Guardian Angel Bear, which I just need to read Cal 50's quote about this album because it's very important. I sent this album to a friend of mine, and he described it as, quote, music from a nightmare you're having where Sonic the Hedgehog is ordering you to kill your parents, and you're a child, so of course you're gonna listen to Sonic the Hedgehog. And that's what this whole album is. It's like not only combining like 17 different genres from like metalcore to IDM to shoegaze to old school emo to like black metal. There are like drum machine blast beats on here. There's vaporwave. There's ambient sections. There's a techno breakdown at one point. There's like every possible genre you could put in an album is here. Angel Markloyd says that when she was in the womb, she was exposed to a lot of prog rock in the womb, and says that explains everything you need to know about her as a person, and that just tracks with this album and the everything about it. But as someone who does not like a lot of prog rock, I think this record is my kind of weirdo experimental throw everything at the wall shit. I heard the beginning of that, the very beginning, and then
I forgot for a brief second that I was sharing my sound, which I found this great TikTok. Which let's just play this TikTok because again, Jackie might be telling you about the new Fire Tools album, but like in a They Live style, this is what subliminally she's saying.
Exactly.
All right, guys, listen up. Got an announcement. Tonight I am transing all of your genders.
What the
Hey, no fussing. All right, line up. Let's go.
That's it. That's just the episode.
Yes, this is what you're...
Anyways. Back to the episode.
This album is great. I,
But
there's
I
there's
will say
no
for
of
something
me
that's like
describing
4
it.
sections and 25 tracks and an hour and 18 minutes, really, really breezes, especially once you break those down section by section. I think,
Totally.
listening to this and the chunks that's given to you is very helpful for like, processing it as a whole. Like, I think section 1 is kind of the one that lays out a lot of the aesthetic choices that you'll hear over the greater record really
Mhm.
well. Like, it doesn't give you everything, but it gives you like the basic tools you really need to understand Fire Tools.
Totally. It's a very like step by step thing where the way the album evolves over time. I really, really love disc 3. That's my personal favorite of the bunch.
Yeah, I think that one definitely gets close. Like Window to Window to Window and Stingy Pain are both like really good ones, especially Stingy Pain, because I just like how Deftonesy, Def Heaveny that
Oh,
is.
totally. Yeah, those two songs, Thick, Glowy, Sparkly, Stingy Pain, .mpeg, and Where on Earth is my Sakananda, which I believe is a Hinduism for like eternal bliss. And those two songs, I believe the second one she described as like Cocteau Twins by way of Deftones, and that's very accurate because it's like this very strummy, dream poppy guitar riff that has screaming and all this. I just really like the way that it fuses the all of its influences together in this pot where I could describe each song in a way like I could say like, oh, To Make Home Be Home is like Mineral plus OPN, or I could also say that I Am a Cloud sounds like Age of but metalcore. Or like I could do that all day with like those kind of this plus this comparisons. But the thing that makes this record so cool is that from second to second, from moment to moment, it is like in constant state of mutation, and like all of these ambient intersections that splice these different genre motifs together are like so vivid and so like in a very vaporwavy way feels like you're going like inside the computer. And I just love all of the like sonic textures and wacky colors of this album. It's just so like intense in the best possible way. This is just like, if you want an insight into the trans mindset, there are 2 albums on this list that are going to give you a great look into that, and this is one of them. This record is just like, there's that one meme I forget. I forget. I'm forgetting the exact wording, so I'm going to get it wrong. But like, it was this thing is like trans mask music be like strums ukulele like something, and then the trans FM music be like the loudest sound you have ever heard. I shit in the fuck. And that's basically like what this is. Like at first it might feel like this record is just like extremity for the sake of extremity. I believe my coworker Max called it a comedy album. But I think that there's a lot of like really rewarding, really satisfying, really emotional songwriting in here that like hit me on first listen, but also like over repeated listens. Like I really liked how like certain moments echo back like the To Make Home to Be Home, and then later on the album To Make Whole to Be Whole, in the way that like there's a really big arc to this record and really like has this big grand like story from front to beginning, but there's also like each one of these discs does work on its own terms, and you can just listen to it. You can just do one disc and then put it down and go back to disc 2 later, and they're in conversation with each other, but they also each work as their own little 7-song, 6-song sections. And yeah, it's just a really, really, really one of a kind record that you should check out if you like weirdo shit.
Yeah. I should comment on this because this was one where it was like, I think it was mostly Jackie and Rose were talking about this in chat for like maybe a week or so before I ended up getting around to this one. And like a running theme that like I'll probably have going for me this episode, and probably why I'll like sit back for like a number of the conversations, is this year has just been like a year where not much has been like hitting me. It's been kind of a weird year where like between the mythical am I aging out of music thing, and also just general disinterest in like whatever big consensus things were, for the most part, I haven't really been clicking with stuff. But this was like one of the few albums where it was like I threw this on at work and it just like made that hour and 18 or so minutes fly by, just because it hit me like probably like during that first disc, which is probably my favorite, that I was like, I have never heard this like particular blend of genres before. It like was the first thing I had heard in a while where I was like, I really have not heard anything like this. ever, and like that sort of thing was exciting to me in an era where it feels kind of like, at least kind of subjectively, a lot of things have been kind of hitting me as derivative or like kind of recycling the same beats. And so like having it as that sort of thing made it like really kind of stand out to me in this year as this experiment that is like taking a bunch of different directions, but also making something that is extremely compelling in all the different paths that it like darts out through.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like we talk about things as kind of like being post genre now, or that you like the sort of questionable relevance of genre in like the post algorithm era, and this is more like active anti-genre where it's not trying to seamlessly blend anything. Like this is a chunky fucking stew, but like it works. It goes down smooth in spite of itself, and I think Jackie's right to identify that like a lot of that is due to the emotional earnestness that Angel Marclaude is able to imbue to like, you know, creative decisions that could very easily read as like comedy or willful genre antagonism in any other context. And it's also just been great to like trace the arc of her career and the way she has sort of like one-upped herself in terms of stylistic boldness from project to project, but again, not in a way that just feels like for the sake of itself. It's a lot of intent behind something that could like superficially read as not having a great deal of intent to it. But I think it is that thoughtfulness she puts into like these utterly wild genre experiments that allow them to work so well, I think, and to resonate so much.
Exactly. Yeah. The point for me, and part of why like disc 1 is my favorite, where it clicked together, because the first couple of tracks are basically like throwing you right into the deep end, and that alone was like catching my attention. But it was the 1-2 of Oddcat Sanctuary into Earning equals Alchemical Fire, which is my favorite track on here, where it feels like the way that she's juggling all these disparate styles is such in a way that it simultaneously feels like it's very much against being one specific thing, but she's also making them kind of coalesce in a way that is extremely unexpected, particularly on the latter of those tracks where you have this kind of this instrumental that I keep comparing to like a weird Dreamcast like racing game while she's like screaming her lungs out over top of it, but it works so seamlessly in just how she's able to like recognize the similar sorts of kind of bones of all of these different genres and things, and putting them together in a way that feels wholly her own.
Totally. Yeah, I really just think it's really neat, and it's really pretty too for an album that is so like genre antagonistic and so kind of trying to disorient you, and definitely throws you in headfirst in like the deep end of the album generally. Like I really like how it also over time starts giving you more and more melody, more and more like and the things that I keep coming back to in the album are those little bits like that very she said she was inspired by Mineral more than American Football for the emo riff on To Make Home to Be Home, but like moments like that are these really like kind of melancholy, like melodic things that really stick out in the kind of soup of vapor wavy industrial screamy stuff going on this record. And I just really think it is fascinating. Like I can't stop thinking about it in addition to going back to individual moments, and it both works as like you can go back to it. It's not like I have listened to it in full a couple of times, but I also like that the chunking of it makes it more manageable to try to approach.
Yeah, and I think like in particular, like the sections that really work for me most effectively are sections 2 and 3, because those kind of get into more like the ambient and IDM-y stuff, as well as like the more niche genre holes, like especially the emo stuff you talked about. Like some of that is just very, very effective blend with the kind of synth textures she tends to mainline in this record.
Yeah, I will say that's kind of why it like sticks out to me, is it's compelling that rather than just kind of stick in the mode that it starts the album with, she unfurls the album in a way where it delves more into these elements that are there from the beginning, but she expands and varies on, especially those very kind of like pretty almost kind of emo and ambient bits, which then occasionally get like buffeted by like straight up metalcore songs, which is always just kind of like a great jolt to the album, where you're like, just when you think the album is getting like completely sedate, she'll like yank you by the collar back into it.
Yeah, it's so good at constantly, like, even when you get into disc 2 and you're like, okay, I think I get what this album is doing now. You repeatedly will learn, no, you do not know what this album is doing, and it is going to continue to find ways to be like, huh? Which, like, the two most accessible songs on the record, like Thick, Flowy, Glowy, Sparkly Pain and Where on Earth, like, those two songs are immediately followed by Avida Shuffling, which is like this fucking insane industrial IDM track that's like, I just love this record so much. I think I cut out for a second there, but yeah, this record is really great. I don't have that much more to say about it. You should just go listen to it.
Yeah.
Well, alrighty then. Let's move on to album number 9. Number 9 on our list. Porter Robinson, Nurture, coming in at number 9. And I'll let y'all take it away. Actually, I think we'll Jackie.
I was going to say we can just copy and paste Jackie's stint from the last episode into this, right?
Like, I am going to give a brief, and I swear to God that is actually true, intro, and then I will let all of you say whatever it is you want to say, because my literal only notes for this episode, which Rose saw on Twitter, was I literally just wrote down, "Don't talk about this album too much, you freak." I have an album of the year post that is up on reddit.com. The only time I go to that website about once a year is for the Indieheads album of the year series, and I wrote about Nurture and Porter Robinson at length. So if you want the long version of this convo, just go there. I tried to specifically format my review as like this context dump of like, hey, if you're new to Porter Robinson, if you just heard about this guy this year, or maybe you heard about him before this year, but Nurture is the first album you really like paid attention to, I basically gave you all the backstory you need. So I'm not going to do that here. You're not going to hear the Porter Robinson was a DJ born in Chapel. Like you got it. Porter Robinson, he's a DJ. He gets really famous at 18 years old. He's the first person signed to Skrillex's new record label. Owlsla is basically the first person that Skrillex says, all right, I've established my career enough that I'm going to start like appointing new proteges, and Porter is basically the first one. He gets swallowed up by the EDM monster and does not enjoy it one bit. Basically says, I was like miserably depressed trying to fit my creativity into these boxes. He makes a synth pop album about it called Worlds, which is very inspired by anime music, video game music. He's happy with the reception to Worlds, but also not really, because there's a lot of things about that record that I think he wishes he could have done better. And like, he's just very perfectionist, and he gets himself mired in a years-long creative slump / block / depression thing that he does some side projects for a while. He starts working on the album, stops working on the album, only listens to Vocaloid music for like 2 years, somewhere in there. It just has a real hard time of it. And then eventually comes back with a single for this album, Get Your Wish, which came out like almost 2 years ago now. It came out like right around the time the pandemic started, which is wild. Like, the rollout for this record was really long, because I think once the pandemic happened, it was like, okay, we've already put out one single, but like, are we going to keep rolling this out immediately? So he did like an extended rollout where like 5 singles came out over like a really long period of time, like a whole year. And then the record came out in April of 2021. I've written my whole review about the record. I love it. I think it is like the perfect evolution of what Porter was trying to do on Worlds, realized to like a fuller degree. I think it builds on his songwriting is so much better on this record than it was previously, and his singing performance too is stronger. And I just like the way that it doesn't try to do the same thing again. It invents its own aesthetic and world, and it makes me really happy. It just does. It makes me happy not only to have it for myself and my own personal relationship with it, but it makes me happy that so many other people have been connecting with it. And now I will pass the floor to my friends who have also listened to this record. Hey, 1.5 minutes. That's good.
No, that was 3 full minutes. I was keeping an eye too. You started.
I started midway through.
You started at 4:33. It's 4:36.
Hey! I went quickly. All right.
I was surprised. I was like, this might clock in at 6 or 7 here, but no, you cut it off quick. I'm very proud.
Yeah, my opinions on this album are a little more reserved. I think the first 8, like if you just took those first 8, this would be a perfect album. Like I think everything up to, I believe it's Dulcite, I want to say. Let me double check.
Yeah, I mentioned in my review that like I don't think this is a perfect record, and we can kind of get into some of the nitpicky stuff on this podcast because I chose to leave that out of the review due to the fact that the review is already like almost 4,000 words. So you don't even need to hear like what my critiques are. But yeah, I don't think this record is perfect. It was not my number one vote this year, and I have my gripes with it. I also agree that it is kind of front loaded.
Like yeah, everything up to Dulcite is like pretty much perfect in my opinion, but otherwise like yeah, like just it starts with such a great like run right there with lifelike look at the sky and get your wish, which I think really kind of distill this record's best strengths, which are like taking EDM, which is a sound I've always been I wouldn't say necessarily confused by, but just like never really attuned to 100%. And so it takes those strengths and kind of like imbues it with like a more naturalistic palette of instruments, like especially like the accordion and the heavy piano and distorted vocal usage. Like I think a lot of that is very neat, and that's like the main strength to me is just like making this genre feel much more, attuned to.
It
I
feels
don't
more
want to say
human.
normal music because that's unfair to it
No,
to a degree.
It's keeping the like brightness and the shininess, but it's also not. There's something antiseptic about the way that so much EDM
Yeah, exactly.
is
Like
made.
it's not. It doesn't feel sterile.
Yeah, and like so much EDM music that like even my favorite like early Porter songs. Porter is one of the very few people who could successfully imbue these big EDM anthems with like the amount of emotion that they're trying to posture as having. But so many of these big EDM anthems are like trying to make you feel so much so hard in a way that feels very forceful. And you're right that there's something about this record that like has that brightness and that glitziness, but isn't like doesn't feel fake and doesn't feel so like claustrophobically produced. And there is something about it that feels very in touch with the natural world, in touch with human beings, even as his voice is being like constantly manipulated and pitched and stuff like that. Like things like the click track in Get Your Wish, which reminds you that like this is someone recording this in a studio. Like it has that kind of metronome quality to it, and like all these other little moments where it feels like real life is kind of peeking its way into Porter's world, which is especially like thematically satisfying as I get into in my piece about how Worlds is such an album about escaping real life, and this is an album about like finding that kind of joy that you would find in fictional worlds in the real world. I agree with you that like Dulcite, that around that midpoint of the album is where the album gets a little fatty, and I think the problem with that is that he has too many songs in this album that are like very clearly songs for specific people in his life. Notably, there's Mother, which is obviously a song about his mom, and then there's
I think Mother is really good.
Mother's great. I love Mother. I'm not anti-Mother, but then there's a lot of songs that sound kind of like Mother with like Sweet Time, Mirror. Sweet Time, I think Sweet Time is one of like 3 songs on this album that is written for his girlfriend. And I'm really happy that Porter is in love. They seem really, really cute. When I saw them live, it was like the first show of the tour where his girlfriend wasn't there. And Porter was like so emo about it that when he was performing the song Blossom, he literally got sidetracked mid-song because he was thinking about his girlfriend and he started playing the same part over again. Like it was genuinely very cute and made me like that song, even though Blossom is like my least favorite song on the album. Blossom is a Plain White T's song, and I think it's nice that Porter made an acoustic ballad for his girlfriend. And like, but yeah, that section of the record, even though I really love Something Comforting and Mirror, and those 2 songs are really important. And I also really like the 1-2 of Unfold and Trying to Feel Alive to close the record. Like Trying to Feel Alive is the perfect closer for this record. It's so good. And so the fact that the record like starts very satisfyingly, ends very satisfyingly, and like I've been waiting for this record for 7 years. All of that adds up to the fact that like I don't care that this record is too long. It's definitely like longer than it needs to be, out of just barely under an hour. But like I don't ever really feel like this album is dragging when I listen to it, even as I listen through like it's hard because like I want to tell him don't have two interludes that add up to a total of 10 minutes of the running time, but
But those are some of the best tracks.
exactly, both of the interludes are really, really good, and I get why he didn't feel like he could cut either one of them. They're both very cool, and
Yeah, the problem material for me is just like the kind of back end stuff. Like I don't really like Something Comforting that much.
that's fine. Something Comforting is the most in the same mold as the first record. It definitely sounds like it could be on Worlds, where most of this stuff sounds evolved in a way that it couldn't be. But Something Comforting just fucks me up really, really bad, and that's what that is. But I like this whole record a lot overall, even though there are like little things I could like nitpick about it. Like it all goes down very smoothly for me. Obviously, I'm very biased. I'm very willing to listen to criticism on this record, but it does the job for me, you know? And I think that it's adventurous and showing off some like really new creative ideas that he gets more into in the World's live show. I think some of the Nurture live show, some of the like new additions to some of the old songs are really neat. And I love this record so much. I love my beautiful boy Porter Robinson. What a great album he put out this year, and I'm so happy that it's not only made our list, but it's made a couple of year-end lists pretty high. It was the Faders album of the year, which is very cool. It's got pretty high placement on a lot of lists, and I think it did pretty well on that aggregate list ranking. So yeah, I'm in the tank. Obviously, I'm holding up right now on camera. Here's my autograph from Porter Robinson. So like I am literally like the target audience for this music in a way that felt surreal to me. This album came out on the day that I came out. Jackie and Nurture were released simultaneously as part of a simultaneous rollout, and it was perfect timing because like I literally listened to it that night and I was like, oh, it's cool that Porter Robinson made an album for me, his only fan that exists on the world. It really this album feels like it's made for me. It's so surreal, like down to like the influences it's pulling on from the very beginning. Porter Robinson's Dance Dance Revolution ass taste in electronic music. Like everything just comes together to make something that feels like the album that was made for me right now in this particular moment in my life. There's one more album this year that even feels more like that, but we'll get to that. Anyways, this record is incredible. I love it. I'm going to shut up now. Go listen to Nurture, cowards.
Yeah, I should listen to Nurture.
Yeah, I'll comment briefly because I only just like listened to it after really taking to Something Comforting for the last episode, which is, it still kind of remains one of my favorite tracks. I'm still kind of like getting my head around this album because it's not necessarily the type of like electronic music I find myself like going for, but I can't deny that there is like a very palpable sincerity to a lot of it. Mm-hmm. And when it does kind of really go for it with its lyricism and its execution of things like the vocal modulation and like the things that Porter's doing with like pitch, or even like Dull Scythe is one of my favorite tracks just because as I posted in chat, I like it when the beat gets fucked up. Mm-hmm. That like just chopping up a beat to hell is like doing that after some like pretty kind of more anthemic or like kind of traditional like electronic stuff is like, I don't know, it's the sequencing of this album, while it does feel like a little bloated and long, I can't deny that like where it ends up, especially with Trying to Feel Alive, like it did kind of hit me close. So I'm gonna spend more time with it, but also like, yeah, no, I'm glad that we have a place for it this year, especially considering that like this is one of the ones that, as Jackie was saying, kind of seems kind of like somewhat of a consensus pick among some circles. So it's nice to have something that like has that sort of resonance and kind of background to it, but also kind of fits within the mold of kind of acclaimed releases this year.
Yeah, I like with the sincerity thing you were saying, like his influences are so genuine, and I think if there's anything to really ding Worlds on, it's how that album is trying to like very desperately trying to be like, oh no, I don't make EDM, like I make serious electronic music, like I'm like Purity Ring, you should take me slightly more seriously and give me pitchfork scores that are more positive. Like there's a little bit of that crisis in that album, and even though like I can tell that he really wanted to make more songwriter driven music and that was the main thing propelling him, there's also a little bit of like take me seriously that weirdly he finally got taken seriously this year because he learned to stop trying to do that, and he learned to just say like, I'm going to do the stuff that makes me really excited, I'm going to do the stuff that I'm really passionate about, and I'm going to do it just like unabashedly and sincerely and like super earnestly, and lands the plane very effectively, I think, with this record. Like it's just a lot of fun. Yeah, go listen to it. That's it. Don't let me talk more.
Well, alrighty then.
Oh God, the pivot we have to make here.
Oh,
boy.
Jesus
Yeah.
Christ.
I checked
coming
that a
in-
minute ago, and I was like,
my notes, I took notes for a lot of what we're talking about today. My first note for this record is just deep sigh. So that's the emotional pivot that we have to make right now.
We're talking lingua ignota, sinner, get ready.
Yes,
Yeah,
I
number 8.
don't want to make this entirely a bummer and make this entirely about what the obvious subtext of this conversation is going to be. If you are aware of indie rock music and the news, you probably saw Lingua Ignota's statement. She released a kind of truncated version of the statement that then you can read the long version, which is like 10 pages long, detailing her relationship with Alexis Marshall, frontman of Daughters, and how he was physically, emotionally, sexually abusive to her. Every kind of abuse you can pretty much imagine. It gets fit into those 10 pages. It's truly fucking horrifying to read. If you haven't done it, I really recommend like going through all of it and then going through what has come out in the time since, which is that there have not only been more people accusing Alexis Marshall of similar behavior and of a pattern of behavior, but accusations have come out against Nick Sadler, their guitarist. And so as someone who was a huge fan of Daughters and has talked about them at length on this podcast and other places, obviously that was like incredibly upsetting, but it's added this new resonance to this album, and I don't want to say it like that because that feels so fucking like cynical and like hollow and not like what I actually. There's no way to listen to this record without thinking, after having read those allegations, without thinking about it in a completely different way, even though this record, it was so bold-faced about how it is dealing with the topics it's dealing with. Like when you listen to a song like Philadelphia Furnace, after having listened to what she went through in the state of Philadelphia with that man, like Jesus Christ, like you just can't not think about it. It seeps into all of the music here, but I also like that this record has this kind of flame of hope to it and this sense of beauty that Caligula didn't have. It's, as we talked about on the episode about it earlier in the year, like this album is a lot more musical than Caligula is. Like there's so much more kind of melody, and it's still got that theatricality and the intensity, the emotional intensity of it, but like there's so much more like prettiness to it. Songs like the Flame of Centralia and some of the other cuts on here, like Philadelphia Furnace, that have this really beautiful piano to it. Like this album really expanded my idea of what Lingua Ignota could be as someone who didn't all the way get into Caligula, because I found it to be kind of more grating to listen to than it was like interesting to me. But like this record, I think I would like Caligula more if I went back to it and spent more time with it. But this record, I was like, oh fuck, this is really amazing. And not just the parts where she like starts screaming like, I'll fucking kill him, I don't give a fuck, like that. The crazy parts where she goes like full on like repent you sinner mode are unbelievable. But it's like the tender and vulnerable and emotional side of this record that really has captivated me as I've come back to it. It's so funny listening to her give her sermon in the background while we're doing this. But
Yeah,
this,
I think in particular it's very satisfying on some level when you get to the more staid portions of the arrangements, because I think that's where it really tends to shine, especially like considering the way she integrates, like she talked about a little bit before, like making this record, like integrating work from Mennonite texts and like traditional, traditional instruments from the area of like those communities, and it's very interesting to see how she sort of integrates these aesthetic choices into her greater sort of subtextual writing about like God's judgment
yeah.
against like abuse and stuff like that. It's just it is a very fascinating like kind of thing, just on a very technical level, I guess, of writing,
Hmm.
even without the personality imbued into it.
Exactly. Yeah, it is a really fascinating text just in like what it's referencing both musically and emotionally. And as I mentioned on the previous podcast when I was speaking for Lily, and Lily can now speak for herself about I get why this gives you music school PTSD. Totally understand that. Totally understand the kind of reaction to the four voiced harmonies and stuff like that. But I really like it. I think all the music school ass shit on this album is really neat and doesn't get in the way of like doesn't get in the way of what I think is really working with this record, like emotionally and like the
Yeah.
core of it.
And just to be clear, like even like I've never kind of been grabbed by the throat by Lingua Ignota albums in the way that I want to be, and this wasn't necessarily an exception, but like I have such an enormous intellectual appreciation for what she's doing, because as much as like sometimes it can be like a little too modern classical for what I have like a tolerance for, there's still no one else really in this landscape who is like thinking about music that way and incorporating it into the
Totally.
popular landscape that way. Like no one else really is making these kind of like choral early music references and really drawing on like the traditional notions of like polyphony and voice leading and all this stuff. Like it's really rare to have that come up, especially in like this sort of like indie metal adjacent sphere that she has found her way into, like sort of like I forget actually who she's signed to, but like the sort of
Sergeant
like
House.
I thought it might be the House. I was like, I don't want to go out on too much
Just
of a limb,
like, I
but
feel like
my gut
90%
says it's
of the
the
artists
House.
within like this kind of sphere, they're members of the House.
It's true. Yeah, that kind of like Sergeant House Sacred Bones wave of contemporary experimental music. There's just no one else really who comes from that world and comes from this world of like really deeply entrenched, Christian orthodoxy and how to like make sense of that in a modern landscape. I feel like she and Hunter Hunt Hendricks are almost of a piece there as like
Totally.
the only two people thinking about like, religious symbology and these, very, very like long-standing musical traditions and making it feel very, very fresh. So like, even, yeah, if like, this album is not necessarily like an easy listen or like it's not something I've been compelled to return to very often, but like I am so glad that it exists now for, a multitude of like very intense reasons. That, yeah, I think this album deserves every like plaudit it's gotten, even if, I have not, like I said, like been personally grabbed by it in the way that a lot of people seem to have been.
Yeah.
People are not wrong to be grabbed by it.
Yeah. Oh no, absolutely. I'm kind of I'm in a similar spot to you, Lily, and I've been meaning to get back to it. Just kind of as more and more people have been in my life getting into Lingua Ignota. It's fascinating that for something this like kind of ideologically like dense and experimental, this is it feels like kind of a big sort of like breakthrough point for her, at least in terms of like people that I know who aren't necessarily like into metal have been like getting into her in this album. And I think that's partially because the parts of it that do resound with me are the parts that I think really kind of break apart what can be done with that sound. So like specifically the parts that get very kind of choral or like very kind of experimental chamber music-y, where she's doing all of these bizarre things with kind of self-harmonization and kind of multi-tracking, and how she overlays elements of, say, like noise or harsher elements that kind of build on top of that. And for that reason, Men is Like a Spring Flower is like the one for this album for me, because it kind of starts in that territory and just gets more and more harrowing to listen to the longer it goes on, right up until that like really abrupt noisy ending. So I'm gonna this is another one that I like need to give another shot, but I am glad that we have found a place for it, because it also feels like this kind of like big stepping stone moment for her, where she's kind of really developing a singular idiosyncratic style that I think is really resounding with a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I
mean,
think agreed as one of kind. I didn't really understand it back when it was being interpreted through the lens of, much harsher music when she was doing it on Caligula, because that just wasn't my thing then.
Yeah, I'm in the
cut
same boat.
to now, where I'm
Exactly.
like feverishly listening to bands named like Pupil Slicer on the radio.
Yeah, I was gonna say both of you probably should go back to Caligula.
Yeah, I feel like now is the time to really try that, but just this music, just like even before like I was fully converted to that kind of thing, I feel like this music just makes more sense to me with this kind of ornate arrangements. I think like even without like I don't want to call it a crutch, because like that's unfair, but like even without the hand of like very heavy the textures of heavy music and like hardcore and stuff like that, she still manages to glean a lot of intensity in places like the sacred lineament of judgment, like the crescendo on that when she's going like, let me find it. Wait, when she's going like, "Oh sinner, have you ever had the love of Christ so ruthlessly denied?" Like, it is so.
Yeah.
Like that arrangement is so pumped up for something that's like just using very traditional instrumentation like that.
Yeah, there are a lot of moments in this record. Like there are the prettier moments, like Perpetual Flame of Centralia, that are, and like I also really, when I was revisiting it, really loved the Solitary Brethren of Ephrata more, the way that ends the record on this really kind of like positive note, but also starts it with the vocal clip of the woman saying she's covered in the blood of Jesus and that's why she's not going to get COVID. That kind of that like dissonance there at the end of the record like really spoke to me this time around. And I like how like you're saying, like even though this record is so much prettier and more traditional than Caligula is, like this record is not intense. This record gets really fucking intense, and it never but it also never feels like it always feels so earned. Like talking about
like
how
the first the first song on the album is like a 9-minute piano ballad that like halfway through just starts hitting the ugliest notes possible.
It rocks so much. Oh
yeah. I was about to bring up the fact that, yeah, that is how the album starts, and somehow this has become like a consensus critical hit. And even more than just a critical hit, like a consensus hit kind of period, at least in our corner of the world, and is so improbable. I would not have believed that could be a thing in like, back when I was studying a lot of this stuff directly in like 2014 or whatever.
And there are a lot of like more drony, harsh sections to it too. Like my favorite song on the album, I think, still is "Many Hands," and I love that song because I think that it's a great example of how the multi-voiced choral arrangements are not just like, "Hey, look, I can do this. Isn't it cool that I know how to do this?" It's like it's literally textual. Like when she says "many hands will be laid upon you," it's like her voice is quadrupling, and it literally feels like this woman is becoming the army of God to rain hellfire upon you. Like it doesn't just feel like something that's being done to like show off that she was classically trained. It's like, oh, this is really like in conversation. The style is textual as much as it is just stylistic. Like,
yeah, I mean, it would be one thing if she was just one of the most like effortlessly acrobatic vocalists in contemporary music, which like she is. But the fact that she's also able to like use that tool and use her instrument so deliberately without and in a way that feels incredibly contemporary without breaking from, the lineage that a lot of this stuff is being derived from, is just like such an impressive high wire act. Like we were talking about, the sort of post genre thing with the Fire Tools album, but to like fuse early music chorales with like, you know, an Emma Ruth Rundle type of thing
Yeah.
is insanely impressive.
She makes it look way easier than she should. It should
Yeah.
it should be way harder to pull this off as seamlessly as she does, and it all just feels like, no, yeah, totally. I can totally imagine going to some weird abandoned church and seeing this performed live and being like, this all makes sense right now, even though it feels like from a different century also.
Yeah, and to get like so into the nerd end and like the very sort of like mathematical end of like, you know, these traditions of like text setting and tone poetry, which like if you read interviews with her, she does, to be able to do that without it feeling like homework either. Unless you're me and this literally was your homework for a few years, like again, is just such a feat.
Yeah, totally. All right. Well, if we don't have anything else to say.
Okay, so for this next one, I want to give a big intro speech, but somebody else can introduce the album first.
Okay, sure. I'll do this one again. This is another one that I'm writing about for a couple of places, and I've been spending a lot of time thinking about it this week. And that record is Grouper with Shade. Grouper's back, baby. Ow, Wolf Howl. Liz Harris, if you're not familiar, is a singer, songwriter, producer, whatever, musician, one person musician project. And they make very, very spacey, spectral, ambient folk music, I guess is how you would. I'm finding it hard to describe Grouper's whole project just like very succinctly because there is so much dimension to it. And what I love so much about this record in particular is that this is the most the widest spanning Grouper album I think ever in terms of what it's trying to encompass in one record. Almost every other Grouper record feels like this very like specific mission that she set out for herself, where it's like, I am going to make a record that is centered around this instrument and is going to be recorded in this place, and it's going to be very, very like very specifically recorded. She has certain albums that she recorded, like Ruins, where she kind of recorded it all in one stretch of time in one place, and it has this feeling of someone that like you feel like you're there with her, like in the space. And that's so much about what her music is about, is creating this ambiance around these songs that she's writing in a way to try to make them hit on a spiritual level more than a lyrical level. Like there are a lot of Grouper songs where it's not just that I can't really hear what she's saying. There are Grouper songs where it's like I have no fucking clue what any of these words are. I have no fucking clue what this person is even remotely trying to say, but like you feel it in a Cocteau Twins sort of way. They've said that Liz Harris has said they're inspired directly by Cocteau Twins and like how feeling can transcend language. But I think that this record is fascinating where it sits in the Grouper discography, because it's basically like Grouper's Magic 10 Tricks Point Never. It's like, let me go through all of the different versions of myself and my musical project, and like instead of having them exist on these separate projects, like have them like blur into each other. And the way that the record, from the very first two songs, like the very first song on the record is Disordered Minds, which is as fuzzy, ambient, far away as Grouper ever sounds. Like it literally sounds like it's being recorded on the other side of a lake, like very, very far away from you, and you can just like kind of hear it like faintly in the distance. And then
the mic is under the lake, like
yeah, exactly. Like there are multiple songs that on this album that sound like they're recorded at the bottom of a hole, like at the bottom of a lake, like as dingy and hard to understand what she's saying as possible. And then the moment where that first song cuts directly into Unclean Mind, which is the clearest song that Grouper has released in years, and is like the closest to a real pop tune she's had since like Headache is the only one that's like kind of similar. It's Unclean Mind is catchy. I don't know how else to say it besides the fact that it doesn't really have it. Unclean Mind has a chorus. Pale Interior is also catchy without having a chorus or even a repeated line at all. But like there are moments on this record that are somehow like the most kind of pop forward stuff that she's done since Dragging a Deer. And even they sound even clearer and more upfront than some of the Dragging a Deer stuff. Like this record is very hi-fi in parts, and then it's very incredibly lo-fi in parts. And those two dynamics are like being butted up against each other constantly in a way that reminds me of the two most recent Low records a lot. Like it's using sonic fidelity not as like an ambience setting tool. It's using it as like this vector that the music is existing along, and it is constantly like moving from one of those states from another, as like you're simultaneously getting like some of the most lyrically dense and lyrically upfront music that Liz Harris has ever made. Like Pale Interior as a song, there's she says more in that fucking song than like any other grouper song ever. That song is so lyrically dense. I've spent the last week just like thinking about all the things that get said in Pale Interior and how like offhanded all of them feel, but how that song is like a fucking poem. It's just, there's so much going on in this record, but it's also so much kind of breezier and easier to consume than a lot of other grouper records because it is just so upfront and bare, and I think it's really special. It might be my favorite like grouper record like ever. Like it's hard to say how it stacks up against AIA and Dragging a Deer and like my favorite ones because I've just had it for a short period of time, but like there's something special and different about this record that feels like for the first time in years it's not just like, oh, another grouper record. It's like, oh, this is like groupers trying to gather together all of the things that have existed in this project before and like take the next big leap of like where this project is headed. And I just think this record is like fucking phenomenal.
Okay, so I wanted to get this out like several minutes ago, but here's my statement on this record. Very, very lengthy thoughts coming in. I'm going to be respectfully muting my mic and getting up from my desk to grab a few Triscuits, 2 slices of habanero cheddar cheese, and raspberry preserves. I will be returning to speak again when this segment is over.
I knew this was coming. Rose spent too much time hyping me up for her thoughts on Grouper. I knew we were getting. I knew a no-show was coming. It's fine. Listen, I'm going to address the Roses and the Phoebe Bridgers of the world right now. Phoebe Bridgers called called Grouper like cool background music and like quote unquote classical music for people who like indie rock or something like that, which are both wrong in so many different ways that it's almost impossible to begin unpacking the ways that it's wrong. But I hate that Grouper gets categorized as background music just because there's not always the like clarity of like real like songwriting comprehension in the way we're traditionally used to, where like you're able to like unpack the message very clearly. Like not only is Liz Harris like a very enigmatic not vocalist, but enigmatic lyricist. Like there's so much about the way, not just the way it's produced and how it's hard to hear, but also the way like the lyrics are written in such a way that is so hard to pull out, that even when you're given a song like Pale Interior that is like so plain faced and is like the closest to like an Elliott Smith song we've ever, or like a Sufjan song we've ever heard from Liz, but like even I've just spent time staring into the abyss that is that song, and I'm still like, I don't even know what to say. Like, what do you even say about a lyric like, how can we relate in a world where people move along the edges, sit in hiding places, waiting for the world to die? Like, what the fuck do you say about that? How do you even begin to unpack that? I love this album so much. I think this is an album that not only have I loved it since the moment it came out late this year, like, this is going to be an obsession of mine going into next year, something that I'm continuing to try to like pick away at the layers at and try to really get to the bottom of what it's doing.
Yeah, to go back to those Phoebe digs, like as you were saying, this album feels very much like a sort of like conscious, I don't know, corrective almost to sort of like what the stereotype of a grouper album has become, especially in like the last decade, where Liz Harris had kind of this like second breakthrough with Ruins. Yes. And then, Greta Points similarly was like extremely fuzzed out and dense. And like, it very much seems with this that they, consciously were like, by the way, I've been writing like capital S songs under this fuzz this whole time. Like, I am not just like musical packing peanuts or whatever.
Yes.
Like, the fuzz and the blown outness of it is like an important, textural and expressive element, but it's only serving to, sort of hone in on the bones of like what, again, I'm like capital W writing, which are often these uncannily like geometrically perfect minimalist pop songs, essentially. And this does feel like a very deliberate sort of like peeling back of that layer and sort of like popping the hood and showing what the like inner musical like and notational workings of grouper songs are, and not just, again, like the textural elements and the production elements to them, which often can be what people kind of like focus on. Like I got really back in the Liz zone a couple months ago as the leaves were changing color around here.
As one does.
As one does. One's gotta. And I like started trying to learn. Oh my God. What's like the big song off of Ruins? It's the second one. It's
Labyrinth?
like the one that... Yeah, I think so. The one like big piano ballad at the beginning of that album.
I'll look it up.
I don't have the track.
If it's the second track, it's Clearing.
Yes, that's it. Clearing. I like pulled up the sheet music and tried to learn Clearing on piano just to like see what was kind of behind it. And that song is so... It makes sense that kind of became the grouper song of the last 10 years. Because again, it is so like... As I keep saying, it has this sort of perfect pop geometry to it where there's like 3 or 4 notes in that song total. Like it has one chord change and then it just goes back to the like starting chord, like so stripped back, and yet there are miles and miles of depth to that song. And this album really feels like Liz sort of honing in on like, no, okay, we're going to dispense with the sort of like flourishes here and really just show you like what exactly is happening on a mechanical level beneath all of my music that allows it to resonate in the specific way that it does. Like this is not just fluff or ambience for ambience's sake. Like there is something conceptually greater going on here. And yeah, I think I have not, ironically, it's like Shade Hype got me back in the Liz zone, and then I was kind of out of it by this time Shade actually came out, so I haven't spent as much time with it as I would have liked to. But yeah, it will be very, very interesting to see, I think, where they take the project from here, given what is sort of like almost established. I don't know if this is quite right, but like this feels a little like an establishment of a second or third act to their career, whereas like the Nivek
totally
album,
agree.
which by the way rules,
Yes,
kind of maybe my favorite Liz project period. AJ and I agree, I think.
it's a valid thing. Nivek goated.
Yeah, but yeah, it feels like not even a soft reset, but yeah, just a line in the sand of like, okay, Grid of Points was sort of like as far out as I can get into this like zone of complete haze, and now we're really going to start to go in a different direction, and in a way that like belies the expectations of people with like a superficial interest in grouper, but then I think also like reaffirms the expectations of people who've been sort of like following the project from the early stages, from like the Dead Deer era.
No, totally. Like that's the thing I love about this record, is that it simultaneously is peeling back the curtain, where it's more unvarnished and more about these capital S songs than ever before, but it's not like the complete concession grouper album where grouper's like, okay, let me make an album the way you think you want me to make an album or whatever. This is not like group. I mean, not to just keep harping on it, but this is not grouper making a Phoebe Bridgers album. Like that could exist in some dark hell world where grouper just makes like a straightforward record. But the thing that's fascinating with this is the moments that are clear on this record and easy to understand feel just as enigmatic and far away as every other grouper song does. Like even on Unclean Mind, where you feel like these songs are very confessional and open-hearted, and like these immediately easy to get into pop songs, but there's just something where you're like, I still feel like I'm not getting the full picture in a way that's like hypnotizing, but then also you've got like, it's not just a clear record where it's constantly fluctuating between the two, and it's like taking these big songs and these big more formed ideas and like dragging them through the muck of the distortion, and basically saying like, here, I'm going to give you a peek inside my mind, but it's still going to be really confusing, and then it's going to dip right back into the muck again, and then it's going to come back out the other side, and then it's going to be talking about something different. Like, it is such a journey, not just through like her the different songwriting stuff that's going on, but also in the way that it's like dealing with like time, space, and the production of it, and like how it both, because this is like simultaneously the most unvarnished grouper record, but it's also the most constructed. Like, all of these songs were written over a much longer period of time than I think is typically the case with a grouper record. Like, these are all song-ass songs that came up with at different points of time, and then were eventually constructed into this very purposeful statement, where it's not like other grouper records are not very purposeful statements, but they're done in this more acoustic sort of way, where like on Ruins, there's the song where the power goes out in Liz's house, and they're recording while the power is out, and you hear the microwave come back on when the power comes back on again, and the microwave sound gets left in the recording. Like, that's one way of grouper's style that is basically like a whole career being made out of the moment. In the Sufjan song, in John Wayne Gacy Jr., where you hear Sufjan like take a deep sigh at the end and like step away from the piano, it's like Grouper's career for a while was like making a whole world out of that moment, making a whole world out of what can happen when you get into the little intimacies of like someone ASMR breathing over like these tiny little piano chords. But like, I love how this record, like, both, like you said, reaffirms and explodes the notion of what a grouper album is at the same time. That doesn't feel like a concession in any way. It doesn't feel like grouper just doing like double negative. Like, we could have also heard just like grouper Liz could have just hit up BJ Burden and made like my own version of the Low record, and that would have been cool. But I'm glad that we didn't get exactly that. You know what I mean? Like, I think this is it's so of a piece with the rest of the grouper discography, while also being so standalone on its own. Like, this is this own experiment.
Yeah, it is kind of wild that like this could be the only grouper album you hear, and you would kind of get a sense of the breadth of like their entire discography, of like what the arc of the whole project has been, without it really entirely sounding like anything they've done before either. And like you said, like, the magic trick of it is that for as much as it sort of like is superficially pulling back the curtain, in doing so it almost only kind of like elevates the mystique and the elusiveness that I think is such a central quality to their music.
It's bridging the gap between dragging a dead deer up a hill and cover the windows and walls, basically, is what it's doing. It's like saying like I can take the very fuzziest origins of it and like the most explicitly pop stuff, and I can string these things along a line and show you how they're in conversation with each other. And that's just really fucking cool. We should also note that this is the gayest grouper album of all time, and for that it also gets points. The 1-2 combo of The Way Her Hair Falls and Promise is like, it's like the grouper version of a Lamelda album, and it's so gay. And I can't even handle it. It makes Promise especially is just like rips my fucking heart out. I like that your pretty eyes, your pretty smile, that's not what I like about you. All the repetition of that's not what I like about you. After the first song of the two is about like, wow, the way your hair falls is just the prettiest fucking thing in the world. And then the second song is, you've got the prettiest eyes, you've got the prettiest hair, but that's not what I like about you. You take good care of me, and I like that. I promise to take good care of your pretty blue eyes and your long blonde hair. This album is really good. You should listen to it. Kelso Blue Sky is also a perfect closer to this record. Oh my god, what a beautiful song. Yeah, Grouper, great. Liz Harris, great. Shade, great. That's all we have to say.
Alrighty. Well, number 6 on our list, and the last album of part 1 of this podcast. Number 6, Dreamwell, Modern Grotesque. We talked about this band a little bit on the
Hell
Pod
yeah,
Awards
baby.
episode, but hey, let's get more in depth right now.
Yeah,
Take it
another
from
one
there.
where the four of us cashed in all our clout to do this.
Hey,
Which, by the way,
I'm not in the coalition. For the record, I like this band. I will let you all talk about this band because you are all better
I'm
people
gonna
to
be
talk.
honest, I kind of goosed it a little bit. I like this record a lot. It's in my 20, but y'all are probably more qualified.
This
to
is
talk about
mostly
it.
the me and Lily zone.
oh, this sure is. And also, like, as much as we're talking about the coalition on Mike as a bit, I do want to say that, like, this top 10 list came about pretty much entirely organically, maybe more so than like any of the lists we've done previously. This
For the
just
first time we had blind ballots.
yeah, the blind ballots really helped, and yet somehow still with the blind ballots, I don't know, this made its way into the 10. Like we had, I think
it was me, you, AJ potentially were like all highly ranking
I
it.
was
I
gonna
think
say
Gil might have voted. I'm not sure. I don't remember the ballots.
we do have to give credit to AJ for being the number one trans ally and helping
Yes.
get some of our passion projects over the line. AJ, you win the most trans brownie points for the month. You get a pizza party. Congratulations!
It's true. I remember who briefly got thank you into the 10 in 2019.
Salute.
Wasn't the rest of you, that's for sure.
I wasn't around.
Oh, okay. All right. This is I've been on the bench a lot this episode, and now I'm really getting revved up. Now we're getting fully into the me zone here. Screamo is back, baby. And I'm not even gonna say it's gayer than ever, because or it's gay again, because it was never not gay, but it is like reached unprecedented amounts of gayness here, and it makes my heart so happy. I feel so vindicated. Like a running theme of this year has been the shit that I loved when I was a teenager, and like that apparently me and a lot of other people were never like really allowed to participate in, and always had these kind of like weird conflicted relationships with. Now all the people who were raised on that stuff are just making it and doing a better job at making it than the people who originally made it, and dialing down the bro meter on it a ton. And it fucking rules. Have we even said the name of the album? It's Modern Grotesque by Dreamwell. This is my album of the year.
Yeah.
Kind of just like by default, but also just, like when I first heard this thing, and this is going to be an immediate, like insanely lofty comparison, but again, as someone with like a long, fluctuating, and often like very tumultuous history with and relationship with metal, and even like the concept of metal music, hearing this album for the first time gave me the same feeling that I had when I heard Sunbather for the first time, where I was like,
Yes.
oh, like this is what I have wanted this genre to be all along. Like this is where it can go. This is what it can do. This is like the energy and the tone and the like expressive vocabulary I want out of it. This album just like completely nails all of that. Like if you were to get my brain to conjure up like my dream, contemporary metal album, like it would basically be this just like fills out the entire bingo sheet of what I want. And like, not only aesthetically is everything in line, but we are getting some of like the best, tightest, like most inventive, most impactful songwriting and lyricism that like, an album in this vein has produced in quite a long time. Again, I'm like, I can't really think of an album other than like Sunbather where I've become so obsessed with really like the poetry of a metal album and the symbology of it and all the little nuances to it. It's a record I've spent so much time with this year, and like I know I'm going to continue to spend a ton of time with, because like it is that thing where something falls so in line with your sensibility that it doesn't even really feel like you're hearing it for the first time. It just feels like some other group of like really like cool Rhode Islanders who would be really sweet to hang out with, like have somehow pulled your ideal album out of your brain and just made it themselves, which also like very cool that like I said, enough people are having this idea at the same time and, you know, have the skill to execute it, that again, it feels like finally, this is what I wanted all along. This is what, you know, little old ninth grade me who was trying to, you know, make ends meet with what was around at the time, like wished I could get out of an album, which is basically just like, as I've said, no, this is too derivative. This is not an entirely fair comparison, but just an album that gives me the feeling as The Roots Undo does, but sunbather-fied and gay is just turning into full word soup. But, you know, just to make the point. So surely at least one person out there knows what I just meant by that.
It's the Rosetta Stone of metal stuff.
Yeah, exactly. It just, you know, again, the level of superlatives I could throw out about this thing to no end are telling enough in and of themselves. Yeah, it's so good.
Yeah, I can jump off of that because I was sitting on the bench for a bit, but I feel like I'm the other one here on this episode who this is like really, really high up for me. This is my number 2 of the year, and it's been one where it was like, because I do want to give Lily credit where credit's due, because she was the one who was the first person who dropped this in the Discord, and I remember dropping everything at like the descriptors that she was giving off and being like, oh shit, I need to listen to this right now, and just remember just with full detail the kind of like visceral wave it had as it washed over me. Just because there is I had been getting more into like stuff like post-hardcore and scrams over the past year or so, and to hear an album like this contemporary that to pull from the band's own descriptors, making it more gay, more trans, incorporating things like religious stories, incorporating those kinds of like elements as like transgressing against the normative, things like angles like abuse, queer relationship stuff, channeling it through these intense fucking riffs and drum beats and screams, constantly bringing in like different elements that feel very literary, because I'm going to put a mild disclaimer here that I have started becoming kind of like pals with the Dreamrell crew through virtue of like covering them through stuff while I was like still in the area, but like the way that they always describe their lyricism is kind of like filtering it through the lens of like getting really into like Flannery O'Connor and really kind of working that out. And you can see that in stuff like the Ballad of Dominic Allegheny especially is like one where it feels like that, and the like bridge of Modern Grotesque, the title track, which I know like Lily also has a lot of feelings about, but it's an album that I feel like has really been one that I've wanted, just because one of the things that we've been talking about is kind of like album flow and album sort of cohesion and like proper lengths, and like this being like basically like a tight 10 track 40-minute thing where it's constantly kind of being cognizant of that. So like the first like 3 songs all kind of like running into each other one after the other, and then the last 3 also kind of like pulling that same trick really helps to make it feel like this like giant cohesive project where also every song is kind of doing something different, whether it's like the particular approach it takes to like post-hardcore versus like the subject matter and the lyricism. It's just, and they know when to like really switch it up, like Plague Father Vermin's Son being like basically right at the midpoint of the album, where you get this like much kind of cleaner song where the lyricism in all of its kind of really kind of tortured agony is like right there. It feels like such a stark contrast considering like the very kind of punishing approach instrumentally that had been going on for the first half of the record, and it basically kind of serves as like this nice little buffer before you go into like the like wild stretch at the end. I don't know, it's been an album that a big theme with me this year is that like this has been a weird year in that like Q1, Q2 stuff has stuck with me far more than any other quarter. And this is definitely one of those cases where I heard it like, I want to say like maybe late February, beginning of March, whenever Lily dropped it in chat. And like, since then it's been one of the few albums that I find myself kind of going back to over and over as a like complete project, just because it feels like this giant unified statement of an album, even with all the kind of disparate instrumental and lyrical paths that it takes. And it feels kind of, it's part of why I've ranked it so high, is because it feels like it's been there with me like through the entire year, and kind of hanging on to the effect that the album has had has really kind of made it loom over what to me kind of the year has been about. And especially I feel like, as we've been talking about, like this year being kind of like a big year for metal genres and like styles that were once kind of in vogue in like a different fashion or broier in like the mid 2000s, kind of coming back. This really feels emblematic of like the potential that could be there for that.
Mm-hmm.
I would just like to point out a running theme of this episode that you find is that trans people are really good at naming songs. Some of the examples from this album include A Crouching Tiger Waits for Prey That Never Comes, Plague Father Vermin Son, You Dreamt of Me, I Dreamt of a Mountain of Salt, The Vessel Bears My Face, Sisyphus and Happiness. Really great stuff here. Just like A+ song naming. I will just say my one piece with this album is that I like it a lot. I think it's great. Dreamo are cool. John Darnielle of the Mountain Goats fame likes them. I like them. My friends like them. Great band. I slightly prefer the other Aki Makala project from this year, which is Vivid Illusions, which is her album with a friend of hers that they said they started, quote, 3 genders ago, which is hilarious. They've been working on this album for like a very long time, and they finally finished it and put it out. And it is, if you like modern grotesque, but you want it a little more deliberately death heaven-y, if you want more of like the kind of shoegaze and post-rock stuff and the prettier guitars. If you're like me, if you like your heaviness to go down with some sugar, like that album is one I would also highly, highly recommend checking out. I think it's fucking fantastic. But I also do love Dreamwell and love this album. It just did not stick with it with me the way it did for some of you, but I don't really have a lot of like critiques about it. I think it's fucking rad.
Yeah, honestly, I have a similar situation where, like, I really like this, but also I just haven't gone back to it as much as I want to. And I think that's just partially because of the time it came out. I was just, like, in the complete dumps when this dropped. So I've just kind of associated with that, and I'm just like, bad vibes.
I think I have that relationship
a lot
with it because I was in the dumps when it came out.
Yes.
So, like, I was still like, at the time, I was still very scared of this kind of music. I was just like, I understand what it's doing, but I'm not sure I grasp the stylistic language it's going for fully. Although I do now, much more to a degree. But just like back then, I was just like, I have no idea what's going on. I have no idea what any of this shit is, and I'm scared.
What is a scrams was what me and Rose were asking like 9 months ago.
Lily had only just gotten me into like that one Under Oath album that I'm forgetting the fucking title of already.
Yeah, no, it's I had a similar relationship to, I feel like Lily did, where it was like March of this year was just kind of like absolute hell times for me. And part of why I was like, because I remember at the time I was like basically frantically like messaging anybody who had like good metal recs and being like, give me good metal shit, I need to get into this. It was because I was just like, I am in the mental zone where I need something punishing. It's like the only way I can like feel right now. And it was this coming along right when it did was basically like a very specific kind of emotional latching on that I feel is incredibly subjective to like how I kind of use music to go through situations like that.
Yeah, I've long had this theory that you're either like you're either a wallower or not, and I very much am, where it's like I like the music to match where I am at. And so, yeah, this came out at a very good time for that. But like, also, it's also very funny to hear the like metal newcomers be like, yeah, it's like a little too punishing. I'm like, yeah, punishing. that's the word for this pop album by like, average metal standards. But yeah, like a conversation that I've seen come up from like a couple different people in regards to this sort of like queer and trans like metal revival that we're starting to see happen is like this notion of expanding the vocabulary of what the genre can do, that there's this sort of misconception that is a self-perpetuating one to a degree, that like metal is just for like, you know, aggression and sadness and despair, and like that it's all just like this font of negative emotion. And like, you know, something I've long felt that I'm now starting to see other people articulate as well, which is cool, is this idea that like it's not really about like emotion in any particular direction. Like what it is a musical vocabulary for is intensity of emotion. Like that's what it's about. And that emotion like doesn't necessarily have to be negative. And I love that, you know, we get a lot of moments of that on this album. Like, you know, arguably the most punishing part of it, which is like the end of Sayaka, is like an extremely, you know, cathartic, and like when you really start to unpeel that song lyrically, like, you know, kind of uplifting conclusion that song draws, you know. And there's like a similar catharsis towards the end of Plague Father Vermin's Son, with the like I don't hate you anymore, because if I did, that would mean I still think of you at all. And this narrative of sort of like getting away from under these sort of like lingering clutches of a past abuser or whatever. And like, you know, Sisyphean happiness is ultimately like, again, like a very uplifting note to end on, in terms of like, you know, life's hard, but you got to find what you can. And I hope to God I'm not like, you know, woefully misinterpreting the lyrics to any of those songs. But like, you know, the point being that like this album also serves as a really great case study for like the multiplicity and the sort of like three-dimensionality that is possible in metal, and that, you know, people have been doing in the genre for a long time, but has not really been recognized in the same way, or like, you know, that complexity has not necessarily been people's takeaway. Like they usually just hear like loud guitar and screamy person and assume that like someone must be angry. And, you know, like a lot of the time they can be, but and like, I was not expecting to reference Hunter S. Hendricks twice on this episode, but like, you know, that it's really more like she's sort of popularized the notion that like ultimately what the genre is after is, you know, a kind of like transcendence, in a way that it's about sort of, you know, pushing against the constraints of the body and the mind, in hopes of finding this sort of like, you know, better, more elevated place within yourself. And I think, you know, that this, like I said, stands as, you know, a great case study in that, in, you know, the many, many different directions the genre can be taken, and the many different things it can express, you know, without even really breaking from its conventions that much. Like, in a sense, this is a somewhat like over home plate Scrams record, and yet the, you know, mindset and the sort of sensibility that they approached the writing of the record with allows it to, you know, feel, I mean, what I love as someone who has been listening to this stuff, you know, since I was like an early teenager or whatever, like for, you know, 15 years now, is that, you know, it strikes that perfect balance of feeling, you know, very familiar and yet like completely new. You know, it's they took the building blocks that were already there and just arranged them in such a way that it's like, oh, right, yeah, this is the thing that everyone else was after, that like, you know, they so often like struggled to attain or never bothered to attain. And, you know, like this band had the clarity of vision to see that through and just execute it in a way that is so exciting and, you know, affirming and uplifting to me, and gives me like so much hope for, you know, where this wave that has really sort of like exploded in the past couple of years is going to go. There's just so much potential, you know, that I always think of when Ithaca broke out, like they said that, like, I think Jamila Azu said, you know, this is the band that none of us were ever allowed to join when we were like growing up in the scene. Like, then we all just found each other. But like with Ithaca, I think she said, like, for most of us, this is like the first band we've been in because we were never like allowed to participate in this before. And so again, just the fact that that is happening more and more and in increasingly like novel and complex ways is very exciting. And yeah, like this was, you know, I just like felt it in my bones. I think it was like maybe not even halfway through Sayaka on my first listen. And it was like, I remember very vividly, it was like 11:30 at night that I just started like pounding the alarm in the chat of like, everyone needs to get on this, because like, you know, I felt that it was a record that like as much as it was playing directly off of things that I had always enjoyed, it was doing so in a way that like did not require you to be familiar with that language really in order to access it. There was an accessibility and immediacy to it where it's like, I think even if you have not spent much time with the genre, you can get what it's about. And also that it can be a record that can make you like see the appeal of the genre in a way that you might not have been able to before.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like it was a good gateway to the stuff I've kind of further dived into throughout the year.
Yeah, you really like took to it fast. It is funny to think of you being like scared of modern grotesque and then like earlier in this episode stumping for pupil slicer.
But yeah, no, to jump off of what Lily is saying, kind of like to bring my own perspective into it, like the coming into this like as mostly around the time where I was like just starting to get into metal stuff, because I feel like up until that point it was really just like my venturing into it was like Death Heaven for years, and then like wading into the kind of like Oathbreaker and like Under Oath pools, but not really like delving too much like deeper into that. And like this, what I think this album does is really well is kind of that point that she's talking to, which is that it provides enough kind of reference points and like sort of clear inspirations and kind of places where it picks up the baton from different kind of subgenres and runs off with it. But it also feels in its own way kind of very sort of like welcoming in how it is trying to both process those emotions and also kind of what sorts of things that it is trying to say with its songs. Because like, I know for me, like a big thing that like put me off from the genre until like starting to both see more people who were like me in it, and also like starting to kind of reclaim stuff that wasn't explicitly full of people like me, but kind of finding my own sort of fun in it or meaning and resonance in it, is kind of this idea that it is a very sort of trans inclusive, and that is even there in the lyricism too, band of people, and within the lyrics themselves is very much there. And also where I feel like this really kind of does hammer that point home in terms of its accessibility is that it's not always the most kind of aggressive, alienating thing. It does kind of play its hands kind of early on in that screaming does not necessarily equal aggression. It is this kind of outpouring of intense emotion of some kind, but it can be any sort of permutation of things. There's a lot of like clean vocals interspersed through there, a lot of kind of like mode switching. And as Lily was saying, kind of where the arc of the album lyrically goes, and closing with Sisyphean Happiness is really kind of this moment where the band has kind of built up all of these narratives that some have resolution, like Plague Father Vermin's Son, but some of them are kind of left open-ended or left in kind of modes of suffering. But Sisyphean Happiness is this moment where the album really kind of pulls itself together to create this kind of complete statement of there can be and there will be like a sense of like demise or an end, but that does not mean that it has to be without peace or without resolution. And it feels very uplifting in spite of every kind of piece of heaviness and abrasion that is going on through it, because it is kind of reconciling the greater kind of emotional state of the rest of the album into this kind of final statement that drives it all home. And I think kind of seeing the album end with that, especially for me as kind of like a newcomer, made it kind of feel more and more approachable the more I would go back to it, because knowing kind of the arc of the album going into that direction kind of gave it this uplifting feel, rather than like constantly feeling mired or beaten down by returning to it time and time again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like there's such a clear arc, even when you look at like the lyrical bookends of the album, that this is an album that starts with the beating, the shaking, the thing carved in bones, and ends with like, you know, let us smile, crack the face. Like there's a hopefulness and a momentum to that I think, yeah, again, is really like key to its accessibility. You know, I don't know. This was like, again, about a song and a half in, this was my album of the year. There was just no way for it not to be, or for anyone to, again, like make an album more geared specifically towards me in a way that was still so novel. And then, I have developed quite a profound relationship with it since, like pretty quickly too. Like it was game over for everyone else on first listen. And then, I think back to like being in the hospital and like blasting the title track while hearing things no human should hear. Like, it's been with me through a lot of those moments. I have spilled or broken a lot of kitchen implements, like thrashing around to the end of Sayaka over the last year. And yeah, I'm very grateful that, I was able to have a relationship like this to an album like this in this year. It feels like it's been, the opportunities for me to feel that way have been very few and far between. Like post Sunbather, it was pretty much like this and The Language of Injury were the albums in the genre that got to me in this way. And the fact that, it seems like there's only going to be more of them in the coming years is just, the best thing to me as someone who has kind of always been on the back foot of saying like, no, this music like does have value and a lot more like depth and accessibility to it than you might imagine from the aesthetics. I swear to God, this should be taken seriously. And now it like is, and that rules. Ow.
I'd say the crop we have even now is like pretty substantial.
Yeah.
I was gonna
Like,
bring up
just-
in this similar conversation, like everything that you've said about this record, as we've talked about, is how I feel about the See You Space Cowboy album, which just barely missed my 10 personally, but I fucking love that record. That's another great example of literally, like you were saying, it's not just that these bands are like, hey, what if we gay people like reclaim these genres and do them ourselves? It's literally like, I've been waiting to make this album for not just like recently, like for my entire life, like the pent up feeling of like, oh, what would I make if I could make my own metal record that like has all of these influences and these touchstones, but also like combines this other perspective. And you totally feel the like rush of energy that comes from that, of like, fuck yeah, I finally found a band of people that like can help me execute my vision. And it's happening at this time where people are like more receptive to these sounds than ever, like myself included. Like this year has a big part of it has been the metal pilling of Rose and Jackie. And even though this record did not like quite land for me in the same way, like I totally appreciate everything you all are saying about it. And also, as I was thinking about those last lyrics of Sisyphean Happiness, I mean, it's essentially just the metal version of the last song on the Porter Robinson album. It's basically like, look, life's hard sometimes, but you take the small pleasures, and maybe next time hell will be a little smaller, Like it's basically like the very intense metal version of the same kind of like finding optimism and beauty in a landscape that does not provide a lot of it for queer people especially, but just for anyone being alive currently. It's pretty fucking rough out there. And so any records that can achieve some kind of real optimism and uplift without feeling like they're doing so in a cheap way, like so much of the music that came out this year was like these very bummer pop albums, which you got into on the Pod Awards episode, but just a lot of albums that are trying to be like introspective and sort of inward looking in this year of pandemic that just like completely fucking face planted. And you've got
just like failing to look inward at all and just going like,
or the opposite, or the solar powers of the world, just like we're all having a fun time, right? And
meanwhile, she's like accidentally recording the protests happening in the background from the studio.
Gosh, like yeah, exactly. Like there needed to be music this year that could bridge somewhere, that could feel like optimistic but earned optimism that gets to its message of positivity without just yada-yadaing everything else, or that was also able to look at the difficulties of life and really like stare them down and make music that lots of different people could find a way into. And when we didn't get that from our pop stars this year, a lot of us went to more extreme places because we're all feeling very extreme right now. Everything is very extreme and dramatic, and what better way to tap into that than with some loud guitars going boom.
100%.
That's the mentality right there. Like,
yeah. And also just quickly, shout out to Natalie, correct me if I'm wrong, Anthony is the drummer?
I think it might be Justin.
No,
Okay.
Anthony is the drummer.
Anthony's the drummer. Okay.
Okay, shout out to Anthony and Kay for both fucking one-taking this thing.
Yeah,
like, Jesus Christ, that is an unreal achievement of recording professionalism.
Yeah, no, the behind the scenes notes that I should expand upon that Lily is talking about, because I at one point was like tweeting semi recently about like how most of this album is like them recording their vocals entirely in one take, and the same is true for Anthony the drummer, who I should also note, part of what makes the drumming especially impressive is that it was all recorded after he had accidentally stabbed himself in the leg with a box cutter at work.
Yes, yeah, I was going to mention that too. One taked it while injured.
But no, to kind of at least where I am in terms of kind of like summing this up in the context of the rest of the year, like that's been kind of another running theme for me, has been like kind of where I've found a lot of interest in the music of this year is kind of in heavier stuff, not only because it does really encapsulate the realities of what we're going through right now, while also not entirely miring itself in just complete and utter despair or like resignation to any sort of like total demise. But it feels like this has been a trend from like the past few years as somebody who has been like working within like local music communities and kind of seeing how a lot of like different queer subsects of people gravitate towards certain genres. But like it's been kind of a running theme in recent years where like a good number of like different metal or like harder genres of music have been kind of gradually getting more of a queer and trans contingency. And it feels really like this year is where it really has kind of spilled out from like the periphery of things into kind of a lot of where the main discussion is going, and where I think kind of the tide of the genre is going. And I think that stuff like this, stuff like the See You Space Cowboy, I think is a really great like omen of kind of where the genre seems to be heading over the next few years, as this place where not only can queer trans people reclaim it, but they'll find new resonance in these ways of expressing that have been there for decades, and kind of reinvent the genres into something that will continue to be exciting and new.
Very good year for the genre in general too.
Oh yeah.
Very good year for Lily vindication overall. And the
That's what
train
rest of the top 10
shows
is
no
for.
signs of slowing
you hear
down.
Number one, you're like, oh, Lily was right.
Well, oh boy. Well, that ends part one of our Album of the Year podcast. Of course, that was number 10 through number 6. Number 10, Fire Tools, Eternal Home. Number 9, Porter Robinson, Nurture. Number 8, Lingua Ignota, Sinner Get Ready. Number 7, Grouper Shade. Number 6, Dreamwell, Modern Grotesque. And now we are getting ready to move on to number 5 through number 1. So join us very, very soon, as this next, or part 2 will probably be out a couple days, if not 3 or 4 days after part 1. So hey, be back soon with the rest of our Album of the Year podcast. And either at this point or during part 2, we'll have our Soft Sounds list up if you want to spoil yourself. So softsounds.substack.com. Album of the Year list coming soon. I don't know when just yet. But we will see you all very, very soon for the rest of this Album of the Year cast. And see you soon.